Hello, Cinema Moss, or any kind of moth you'd like to be. Welcome to the Writer's Triangle, Cinema Moss podcast about all things publishing and books. Today we're here with Nathaniel Koszer, the author of Kinetics. Nate, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. I'm glad to be back in the writer's triangle.
Yeah, we're happy to have you back. It's always a pleasure talking with you. Getting right into it, are you feeling excited about the release of Kinetics, the sequel to Latency?
Definitely. In a way, I'm more excited about kinetics than I was about latency, because latency, since it was my first published book, like it didn't feel real. I was trying to like suppress anticipation, until the book was out. Now I don't have to worry about that anymore. So like, there's actual like anticipation and excitement. So it's nice.
Yeah, that must feel nice to be able to have that confidence going into it, of knowing what the experience will be like from the previous experience to some extent, right? And be able to
Yes,
relax into it a bit more.
absolutely.
Yeah, something that's not really talked about a lot, I guess, is the difference in feeling from the first book to the second in terms of the level of anticipation that you can have before the release.
Right. Absolutely.
So, following up with that, with kinetics and everything, in kinetics, you jump into events right after the events of latency without giving anything away. Do you still feel like kinetics is a good standalone read, or do you recommend readers read latency first?
Um, I guess the recommendation would be to read latency first. But the that was a concern that my editor had, was to make sure that kinetics could stand on its own if it needed to. Um, so it is written in such a way where if someone picked up kinetics, didn't know anything about latency, um, that they would be able to get along just fine. Um, but when I originally thought of the ideas for the books, I imagined it as as one book. It only got split later on when I realized it was going to be untenably long for one book. So it is intended to be, a whole story, the two books together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that is also a pretty common thing of, you have this whole story from kind of start to finish mapped out in your head, and you start writing it out, and it's like, ooh, it's a little too long.
Yeah, and it like the fortunately latency got trimmed down quite a bit. But when I was at about 110,000 words when I realized, like, okay, this is getting nuts. I need to find a place to stop, and latency's one book, kinetics will be another.
And how did that feel when you had that realization, and then the actual work of separating them? Was that difficult for you, or did you find it pretty easy?
That might have been the most difficult part. Is it it essentially made the battle in New York, that ends latency, um, the end of the book. So as opposed to being sort of the push to the middle. Um, so I definitely, it took me weeks to kind of like figure out the structure and figure out the sort of the aftermath that would be needed for it to be like a solid ending to a book. Um, so it was difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine that separation being hard, as well as not just getting a solid ending, but then also deciding how to make it a smooth beginning for the second book, right?
Yes, that was a little easier. Uh, uh, Mainly the reason being that there was such a big gap in between when I finished latency and when I started kinetics. That was 7 or 8 years in between. So I had a lot of time to figure out, how I would pick up where I left off before I actually put pen to paper.
That makes a lot of sense. Having a bit of a time gap gives you time for everything to settle in your mind, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so going into Kinetics a bit more, you make quite a few bold choices when it came to the writing and everything. Were you always this fearless when it came to your writing? Did the characters guide you? What gave you the confidence, I guess, to say, to progress in this way?
I mean, if I had to choose between those two, like it's closer to fearlessness, but I don't know that that's necessarily the right word. Um, how do I put this? So I've watched sci-fi all my life. Sci-fi cartoons, movies. You name it. I've probably chances are I've watched it. Um, Plenty of tropes that I love. That I can't get enough of. Plenty of tropes that I'm not a huge fan of. Um, So like for example, this is not, the example I'm about to say is not a hint or a spoiler for Kinetics, but thinking about Dragon Ball Z, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the main character Goku is notorious for like an enemy of his does, unthinkable atrocities, kills thousands of people, will kill his friends, his family in front of him, and then he'll, beat them but
Yeah.
let them live. Like it just seems completely unrealistic to me. Like it bothered me. Like I love Dragon Ball Z, but that aspect of his personality just always didn't sit right with me. And so a lot of the choices I made in Kinetics were informed by those things that I've seen in other sci-fi that I didn't necessarily like. So I went in a different direction.
That makes a lot of sense. Being very well versed in the media and the genre in particular that you're exploring, and kind of going, you know, there are these aspects with these stories that I've seen that don't feel right to me, and
Right.
then going, okay, how do I make it better then?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so with that, you did the work to make it better. I think the Kinetics as well as Latency are very wonderfully written books. And one of the things that I find, I think I mentioned it as well in the previous book, is your characterization is really fascinating to me, right? And so I wanted to ask you, can you talk a little bit more about your relationship with the characters and, uh, the expansion that comes with the two books?
Yeah, and yeah, I am glad that it gives off that impression. Um, the I think a lot of it comes from how long the story was bouncing around in my head before I actually found the motivation to write. Um, that it was easily before Latency was written, was easily a decade of knowing like, okay, I'm gonna have six characters. Here's more or less what their origin stories, and then personality kind of comes out of that. Um, so I had 10 years worth of knowing these characters before I wrote Latency, and then again, as I mentioned earlier, it was another 7 or 8 years on top of that before Kinetics was written. So yeah, these characters were 18 years old by the time Kinetics was put down on paper. Um, so I've known them for a long time. So you would hope that I would know them well and be able to write them well.
Yeah, that's true. I guess if you've had them for a while, you become more versed in them, just like with actual people, right? You get to know
Right.
them better over time. But with that, would you say that having them be with you for so long, did that affect kind of your view as well of media? Would you say that they grew with you in a sense, with your exposure to more media as you read more, as you watched more shows, things of that nature? Did any of that feed back into how you decided to make changes in characters or perhaps adjusted their personalities?
Yes. Quite a bit. When I first imagined Latency, I imagined it more as a humorous book. That a lot of the characters would be a lot more lighthearted. Um, but over the years, you know, uh, I don't. Maybe I just watched too much negative media, but it definitely became more of a no. This should be like a serious book. Have a couple lighthearted moments sprinkled in here and there, but mostly it's a serious story about serious things that should call for serious people uh, that are driving the story forward.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me that it would develop that way, more towards the serious side based off of how I read it. I think that was, personally as a reader, I think that was a thing that I enjoyed, was that you had serious characters, but then as you mentioned, there were light moments still that gave for me a kind of a sense of humanity to them, because people in tough situations still find those moments to have some levity, right? Some lightness to it.
Yeah, and it was actually well, I guess I should be careful how I talk about this. There is a chapter in Kinetics where Victor is kind of met with a fish out of water situation, and I was really glad to have the opportunity to write that because that was honestly closer to kind of the goofy story that I had originally imagined. So it was nice to like have a very silly interaction with someone who is usually a very serious character.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and it was an interesting shift, and it was nice to also have that kind of insight into the character of a different facet of them, right?
Yeah.
And going into expanding a little bit more onto characters, do you have a particular character, perhaps even Victor, as you mentioned, whose journey you're most excited about having readers experience as they read through Kinetics?
It is definitely Victor. He shines in this book. His struggles, his victories are, I guess, in latency, it was Sarah's story, right? It was her revenge plot that kind of, or revenge seeking that drove the plot. Um, so that was her story. I would say that Kinetics is Victor's story. So it's his struggles and his victories that we're following. And it was surprisingly emotional to write at times. So I am excited to see people's reactions to that.
You mentioned it being emotional to write. Was it just a matter of the weight of the topics themselves, or is it a matter of the experience of the being able to bring this character to life onto the paper for after so long in your head? What made it emotional for you?
That was definitely a big part of it. Since it is Victor's story, he plays critical parts in the plot. So writing all of that down finally after 18 years of thinking about it was a little bit emotional. But then it also surprised me in certain ways, like that fish out of water set of chapters that I mentioned. Uh, that was brand new. Um, like I had thought of that maybe a week before I actually sat down to write it. So it was as close to pantsing as I get. Uh, so that was emotional in a whole other way that it like I was excited more so than usual to write it because the rest of it is already in my head. It's just a matter of getting it down on paper. But that was, flying by the seat of my pants. Okay, well, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? So it was an interesting experience all around.
That's really awesome. I hadn't thought about the kind of the when we think about emotional, oftentimes we end up thinking of more of the somber emotions, but also the excitement involved with it is also still quite an emotional experience.
Yes.
Now, you've been talking very excitedly about Victor. Would you say that Victor is your favorite character of the entire series, or is it just a matter of Victor is kind of the main focus in this book?
That's a tough question. I do. I love Victor a lot. I love Sarah a lot. Um, but originally, when when I first wrote Latency, or the story that eventually became Latency, it was Edgar who was the main character. Um, and it was kind of just not really thinking about it. It was just circumstance. Like, he was the first character I really thought up. His powers, the energy blades were the first power that I had like a firm grasp on. Like, okay, this is going to be this person's character, this person's power. So he just kind of by default became the main protagonist of the story. And remember, it was supposed to be one story that then got split into two books later. Um, so it wasn't until I eventually rewrote it to make Nadine the main character of Latency, and then when I got the contract with Cinnabar Moth, they you folks correctly pointed out that it's Sarah's story. Sarah should be the main character. You need to start this with Sarah, and it was absolutely correct. So Edgar kind of always has a special place in my heart, since he was the first character to kind of come to my mind.
Okay, that's interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed Edgar initially. With the context that you've added, it makes a lot of sense, but there's just so many vibrant characters and unique personalities in the book that it's hard to get a sense of it, right?
Yes.
As a reader, at least, to guess yours, I would have guessed maybe Victor, just based off of the excitement you expressed and how much, he shines in Kinetics in a lot of ways.
Victor was the second character that I really like thought out, fully fleshed out. Yeah, so I'm excited about him too. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, Edgar kind of has that special spot.
It's really interesting to find out and to hear about the development of, from the original starting point with what would eventually become Latency and the progression of these characters, the stories, and how you viewed them, right? And that change over time. And so, with that, you've had the change over time. You now have Latency that's come out. You've got Kinetics coming out. And we know from the reaction of RPR list with Book Sirens, Library Thing, and everything that you have a nice following. How does it feel to have fans who are following the progression of your work?
It's very sweet, but it's still weird. Yeah, even a year in. I don't know if I ever emailed you or Christopher about it, but I actually got like a fan letter, like a real handwritten letter in the mail from someone who connected with Latency. And that was like astounding to me, that not only first that someone was touched by something I wrote, but touched enough that they felt compelled to write it down and tell me about it. It was incredibly sweet, but incredibly strange. So, and yeah, it's still that way.
And so you enjoy it, but you're not really sure how to fully process it still?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So with that weird feeling and that sweetness of it, does having this fan base, is it more fun? Does it add pressure? How does it affect your feeling going into the writing process, if it affected it at all?
It affected it. It added pressure, but I didn't necessarily mind it. Like that's if anything, that's a motivator for me. So like I'll give you an example. When I first was considering writing Latency, like I hadn't committed to it yet. I wrote just a single chapter that actually wound up eventually getting cut because it was too much exposition. But it was literally an exposition dump chapter about the Loex, about their powers, and like the history, the history before the events of Latency, essentially. So it was one chapter, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 words at most. and I sent that to some friends and some family members, just to see, like, is there anything here? Like, is this worth my time? And everybody loved it and said, it was like unanimous, like, yes, you need to write this. I want to read the rest of this. You better write it. Um, and so it was that, the fact that other people wanted to read it was what spurred me to write it. I don't know that I would have ever put more down than that one chapter were it not for their excitement and their desire to read more.
I think that's kind of a beautiful thing to be able to draw from, the excitement of potential readers or existing readers as a motivation to keep going, right? Or to even get started in a sense, because, you wrote the exposition chapter rather,
Yeah.
but not the rest of it, even though you had it all in your head over all these years, right?
Right.
And so I think it's wonderful that you're put yourself out there to be able to share it to begin with, to get that feedback, to eventually, have now 2 books coming in. Well, 1 book done and another book coming out.
Right.
With that, what are you most excited about your fans experiencing with Kinetics?
Probably the ending. So how do I do this without spoilers? The final fight, and the circumstances that lead to it. Uh, that was the first plot point that I ever thought up.
Mhm.
Like the characters, I kind of like, oh yeah, Edgar could do this, and Victor and Nadine and Naren, they'll be kind of silly. That like that I worked out, but then figuring out the plot, I definitely worked backwards. Like that, the ending was clear in my head. It was how to get there. Um, so it felt nice to finally write it down. And I am really looking forward to seeing how others will react to it.
Okay, yeah, the working backwards, I think, is something I can relate to, because I also, when I was writing my own book, I kind of had that. I have this thing of, I want this confrontation. I have this experience at the end that I think will be really cool. How do I get there?
Right. Oh, that's interesting. So I'm not the only one that works that way.
No. I've talked with other writers as well have talked about starting from the ending. Um, I think the strangest people I've met are the people who start in the middle and then branch out in both directions. Like, how does that work?
Well, those are the pantsers, right? They have the one idea, like, ooh, I want to write about X, and then just whole story blooms out from that.
Hmm.
So I get it, but at the same time, I couldn't possibly write like that.
I totally respect it, but at the same time, it's so foreign to me.
Yes.
I definitely relate to the starting at the ending. A lot of cool stuff happens at the end.
Right.
And so, yeah, with that, as another thing for your fans to look for, aside from the ending, are there any potential Easter eggs or surprises that you can maybe hint at? Because I know, the ending's kind of spoiler heavy, but maybe there are some things you could maybe hint at for them to keep an eye out for.
So yeah. So well, at the very least, there are certainly payoffs in Kinetics to Easter eggs that are hidden in latency. Um, so I guess now's the time to reread latency and see if you can find them in for Kinetics. Um, Kinetics also served as sort of a means to build out the world that the low X live in. So there are quite a few like new character additions, new locations that could certainly become important in books to come if they are to come. There are, at the very least, there are 2 brand new characters that folks will either love or love to hate. Probably love to hate. Um, that I that readers can certainly look forward to.
Okay, that's exciting. I'm I think I might have caught some of the Easter eggs. I don't think I necessarily caught all of them between the two books. So it might be interesting for me as well to go back and check to see if I might have missed something.
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of stuff that when I see it in movies that I want to do that. Thinking back to Avengers when or Avengers Endgame rather, when Captain America is wielding Thor's hammer, and meanwhile it was hinted at 8 years earlier in Avengers 2 when he kind of just made the hammer move a little bit. It's those like subtle little Easter eggs that have massive payoffs later, that I can't get enough of as a consumer of sci-fi, and that I do like to write into my books. So folks can expect that.
That's awesome to hear. I also enjoy East, noticing Easter eggs. I struggle with writing them myself because I feel like, oh, maybe it's too obvious, maybe it's too subtle, and then I get in my head about it. But I enjoy it when I experience it.
Yeah. I mean, like, there was definitely that argument in my head for a lot of those little subtle plot points that you're trying to hide. I just kind of like powered through and wrote them anyway. And like worst case scenario, people miss it, and it's still the plot still moves forward regardless.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, following through that with the plot moving forward, you mentioned that you think that you're most excited about the fans' experience in the end, but what do you think that the fans will love most about where you take the story from, that journey from where it left off to latency to the eventual endings and kinetics?
I think that readers will. I think they'll enjoy that like more global view, and seeing possibilities for what the future may contain. Latency, they the six main characters, they do a lot of traveling from city to city, but it's still limited. It's only North America and then a little bit in Europe. They don't really go anywhere else in the world. The readers don't get to see what other parts of 26th century Earth look like. Kinetics provides that window to look at what the rest of the world is. And so I think that readers will like to see that.
Okay, that's awesome to hear. And I definitely, from my own experience, I did enjoy getting a greater sense of the world that you've built. And for me, I think I enjoyed the fact that it was actually built.
Yeah.
It sounds weird to say, but you know what I mean, right? When sometimes they express, oh, there's so much more out there, but there's not much substance behind it.
Hmm.
I could feel the substance behind the rest of the world when you explored it a bit more, when you hinted at it, and when you talked about it. I was like, okay, there's actual intention and thought behind it that I really enjoyed as a reader.
I am very glad to hear that.
And so following up on the connection between the first book and the second book, did you feel, we've talked a little bit about pressure from your fans and everything, but did you feel pressure just from writing a second book to have it potentially like live up to latency or any of that sort of feeling?
Yes. I felt it wasn't just pressure to live up to latency, but I would take it a step further. I wanted to use kinetics to lift latency higher. I have ideas for more books in the series, and I do very much want to continue writing them and getting them out to the world. But there's a long way to go sales wise for that to happen. So my hope is that now that the story that I originally imagined is complete, latency kinetics will be out. that kinetics will sort of lift latency and latency will lift kinetics, and enable that. So yes, lots of pressure.
That makes a lot of sense. The idea of, with the story being completed, that the full package allows people to, embrace and enjoy it perhaps more than they were before, right?
Yes.
Especially with what you mentioned, like Easter eggs and things, being able to go back into latency and have that enjoyment of that connectivity. That makes a lot of sense to me. And with that, you mentioned it's been nearly 2 decades, I guess, from when you first started, right? And over this process of, from when you first started to actually getting latency, you had a lot of growth and change. And then from there, with latency to kinetics, there was a bit less of a time lag, but still a bit of a time lag between the two books. Overall, would you say that the process has changed you as a writer from not just from when you first started, but also just between, let's say, book one and book two, or even the start of book two to the end of book two?
In between the two books, I would say my process changed radically. When I wrote Latency, I was 28 years old. I was single. I had no kids. Um, I was young enough that I still had the energy to stay up till 4 a.m. Writing 7 hours straight. 10,000 word marathon sessions. Um, and in between Latency and Kinetics, I had a little NaNoWriMo project. That you're supposed to write it in a month. So like I finished it. But it was still like I was married at that point, but um I didn't have the same like priorities in life that I do now. Um so now taking on Kinetics as a 36-year-old, married with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old and a full-time job, um I could not possibly write in that same way. Um, if I have to be up at 5 a.m. to drop kids off at school, I can't be up until 4 a.m. writing. Um,
Right.
so really, I had to a lot of Kinetics. I guess for those who are listening, you're now getting a little bit of a window. Most of that book was written on the one train on the New York City subway, on a 12-year-old Generation 1 Microsoft Surface tablet, because I could not find another time, another window to write. So it was all done on my commute to and from work. So it was a massive adjustment. But frankly, if I'm going to be writing more books, this was a necessary adjustment. I can't stay up till 4 a.m. anymore. So I needed to have this process or this change in my process happen, if I'm going to continue as an author.
That makes a lot of sense. And the change in, what your life is does significantly affect your options when it comes to writing. And that thing about having energy when you're younger, I feel it.
Yeah, it was a shock for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting how much the shift in energy happens when it's like, oh yeah, when I was younger, I could easily stay awake all hours of the night, pop up the next day, no problem. Now,
Right.
I might need a nap.
Yeah, absolutely.
As far you've talked a bit about the time that you write being different. Would you say that the process of your writing has also changed a bit when it comes to, for example, your organization or the direction that you write in? Or is that mostly the same?
That was still mostly the same, but I think that was kind of a product of the story already being in my head, so it couldn't. There really wasn't change there. It was besides the couple of instances where I had random inspiration to pants a chapter or two, um, it was literally just a matter of getting it out of my head and onto my tablet. So yeah, there really wasn't much change in the process there.
Okay, that makes sense. Going forward, do you think that your process is going to maybe look different, or do you think that the process that you built up when it comes to the organization and everything works for you and you're probably going to do the same way in the future as well?
It depends. If I write more in the world of the energy crisis series of latency and kinetics, um, I'll probably stick to the same process because I do have other ideas for future books that again are in my head, and it's a matter of getting them on paper. Um, the I had other ideas for other series that are much less informed than the energy crisis. So for those, well, one of them is high fantasy, so my process is going to have to be different. Yeah, that I'm going to have to build a whole world if I'm ever going to go attempt to write that series. Um, but yeah, so I guess it depends.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I do agree that there has to be some adjustment when it comes to genre for how you frame your approach to writing, right? So I'm excited to see what you do next with that, and also to see how, or to hear about potentially how that process changes at some point in the future. But for now, when it comes to going back to kinetics and latency, both of them share the fact that you find the time to give life to each of the characters in the story, right? Each of them are very vibrant. There's a lot of personality behind them. Was it challenging at all to write such distinct characters while giving them a common goal? Did it come naturally? Or is it something that, because you had so much time, it's kind of hard to say whether it was challenging to begin with?
It was certainly easier in kinetics because of that time that I had. Um, but it's also the plots of the two books are different enough that it was easier to do in kinetics than it is in latency. Like latency, it was a lot of them doing things as a group. A lot of group battles, a lot of interactions between the six of them. So keeping track of that, of the dialogue. Okay, who should say this now? Victor hasn't talked in a while. He's got to say something. But that, and then on the fighting side, forget about it. It was exhausting to keep track of. Um, in kinetics, the main characters spend a lot of time apart from each other. They're off to different corners of the world, um, all trying to achieve their individual objectives to then come together for one final assault. So um, that was easier to write since they were all off on their individual adventures. It was more just like writing six short stories that have a shared origin, rather than uh, writing a huge ensemble cast all interacting with one another.
Yeah. With the experience with that, and having done the huge ensemble cast and having done the more scattered version, do you think you'd want to write another book that has such a large cast, or do you think you might avoid that in the future because of how difficult it was?
I don't think I would avoid it. I do like ensemble casts in the media that I consume. A huge fan of the X-Men. We mentioned Dragon Ball Z earlier. They have a million characters. So I like those stories and the unique opportunities that you get from it. Um, so I definitely wouldn't stray from it. The NaNoWriMo project that I mentioned was a single character. That was fun to write too. So it could go either way.
Okay. That's cool. I appreciate being able to do both, and I think that uh, you having that ability is really cool. Because for me, I struggle with groups of like having multiple characters all active at the same time. Like you mentioned, the difficulty of balancing out the time for their dialogues is definitely a struggle that I found that I decided I would opt out of for myself. But for
Yeah,
you, with your experiences, um, do you feel like you found your voice as an author, or do you feel like you've already had it for a long time and you're just now putting it out there? What is your experience when it comes to your voice and your writing style, per se?
I think if I haven't found my writing voice, I'm definitely much closer than I was. Um, so I mentioned earlier that when Latency got picked up by Cinnabar Moth, um, there were a lot of like edits that were required. Um, edits that, I don't mean that in a bad way. They improved the story, but it was a significant chunk of writing, and so I essentially had I guess backstory. Before, I had written Latency about 5 or 6 years before I signed with Cinnabar Moth. So essentially, I had a side by side comparison between what my writing style had become and what it was 5 years ago. Um, but comparing the edited chapters to the non-edited ones, and it was different. It was the edited chapters felt more like me, I guess. Whereas the older ones felt like, I don't know, they didn't feel like me anymore. And then Kinetics seems identical, if not pretty close to how the edits felt, not how uh, the original version of Latency felt. So I think that's that I found my voice, or I'm very nearly there, and it's probably what folks can expect from me from here on out.
Well, I can say I personally enjoy your voice, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing more of it. And I want to ask you, now that you've got a second book out, do you feel like you can identify as an author, like as a capital A author? Does that title feel like it fits you? Would you prefer a different one, perhaps writer or something else?
It fits and it doesn't. Like I have no problem telling people that I'm an author, but it's not the way I would introduce myself. Like if someone asks what I do for a living, my answer is still, oh, I work for the city, not I'm an author. So in that sense, it's a no. But when I tell people that I wrote a book, I do say, I am an author. I wrote a sci-fi novel, and I like I like the reactions of people. If you can't tell, that typically means a lot to me, how people react. And usually, when I mention, I'm an author, I wrote a sci-fi series, there's like surprise, there's excitement, there's positive emotions that come from that, which it's very satisfying. I could definitely get used to it. So, uh, I'm probably going to be saying that I'm an author as much as I can.
I think that's awesome to have that, that feedback, that positive feedback that also, as you've mentioned, motivates you as well. So I can imagine that will lead to you having more excitement going into future projects. Speaking of future projects, looking ahead, what do you have going on next? What's after Kinetics?
So more than anything, I'm hoping in the next few months or year or however long it may take to focus more on marketing Latency and Kinetics. The Because of how my life is and because I had to focus on writing Kinetics, I don't think I did Latency enough justice when it came to talking about it and doing events, getting the word out about it. Now that the now that the series is out, the original story that I thought up, I would, and and there, there's nothing else immediately planned for me to write. I would like to focus on getting the word out more, and I am going to try my hardest to do that. That being said, I do have ideas for a third and fourth book. So I do really hope that focus on marketing pays off and that I am able to write those two books and get them out to the world for people to enjoy. But that's my main focus coming up is marketing, not so much writing.
Okay. I think that'll be exciting for, your fans if you're going out and perhaps doing like, book signings or things of that nature where people have the opportunity to actually see the person behind the books that they love, right?
Yes.
And so I'm sure that'll be exciting for everybody listening who's hearing about it to be able to have more opportunities to see you and and along with that, I'm sure everybody is looking forward to the release of Kinetics. I know that I, for one, am excited for the release of Kinetics. And I'd like to thank you, Nate, for coming on, talking with me today, being on the Writer's Triangle. And thank you to all of our beautiful moms for listening. Be sure to buy Kinetics coming out March 4th. Nate, can you tell everybody really quickly where they can find you as far as social media so they can keep up to date with what you're going to be doing, where you're going?
Sure. Well, I do have a website. It's natekoszer.com, NATEKOSZER.com. And then I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky and Instagram. My handle is the same on all three. It's at NateJKLOL.
Okay, wonderful. And for all of our beautiful moths, be sure to visit slimbarmoth.com where you can check out the transcripts and we'll have the links to all of Nate's social media. For now, though, Nate, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And for now, bye-bye.